Hi, I'm George Gerbo, and welcome to Washington Times Weekly, where we get the chance to sit down with our reporters and dig into their coverage of the latest news and events. And joining me today is Washington Times national security correspondent and Threat Status podcast host, Ben Wolfgang. It's good to see you, Ben.
Hey, thanks, George. Good to be here.
Absolutely. Iran. That's the only thing that seems to be on everybody's mind across Washington and the world at this point. The president announced a ceasefire. It fits and starts, but I guess you could call it fragile, perhaps tenuous at this current point. What is the status of this ceasefire? And then kind of in addition to that, in recapping these bombings of Iran's nuclear sites, how extensive have they been, and where is kind of the middle ground between what the administration believes was carried out and what some leaks from the Defense Intelligence Agency that have been reported on pretty widely, what they say?
Right. So on the ceasefire, for starters, it's important to remember, and this is kind of crazy to think about, Israel's air campaign against Iran started just 2 weeks ago. And the U.S. airstrikes, of course, were last Saturday. So this whole thing has taken place in under 2 weeks, the start of the Israeli campaign, and then the U.S. last weekend entering the campaign. President Trump announces the ceasefire earlier this week. And so far, as we're recording this on Thursday afternoon, so far, so good. Of course, Trump had to put a little bit of muscle behind it with his profanity-laden, profanity, I shouldn't say laden, he used one expletive as he sort of excoriated both Israel and Iran, telling them to not engage in any more attacks. So it looked like this thing was in danger of falling apart in the early hours of the ceasefire, but so far it's held. So I think that's good news for anyone who was worried about this conflict potentially escalating, drawing the U.S. in deeper. So, okay, we have that aspect here on the side. As far as the actual impact of the U.S. airstrikes against Iran, the 3 nuclear facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, that is kind of the $64,000 question right now in all of the military and national security circles, folks that I'm talking to, is exactly what do we know about what was destroyed and how long it would take for it to be rebuilt. Of course, just, this morning, Defense Secretary Hegseth and Joint Chiefs Chairman Kane held a press conference at the Pentagon, pushing back hard, as you mentioned, on that Defense Intelligence Agency preliminary report on the damage, which, as some media outlets have tried to characterize it, that this didn't do as much as Trump is saying that it did. It didn't obliterate Iran's nuclear program. There's a couple of points here that I think are worth keeping in mind. One, which Secretary Hegseth raised this morning, he said, if you want to know the actual damage at Fordo, for example, you're going to need a shovel because we dropped multiple waves of bunker buster bombs onto a site that was buried a half-mile underground on the side of a mountain. And by all accounts, while we don't know the shape of the actual centrifuges and the facility inside of that mountain, what we do know is there's a giant pile of rubble on top of it right now. And so it is essentially physically impossible to know to a large degree exactly what unless Iran has some sort of monitoring or video equipment that that's survived and they can see it. But we, of course, wouldn't have access to that. So it's tough to know right now. The IAEA, which is the UN's nuclear watchdog, has said centrifuges at Fordo no longer operational. John Ratcliffe, CIA director, says Iran's nuclear program was severely damaged. So it does seem like this preliminary intel assessment coming out of the Defense Intelligence Agency is a little bit at odds with what we're hearing elsewhere, both internationally and here in the U.S. But look, the long and short of it is, and this might not be the most exciting answer, George, but I think it's the truth, which is we just don't know yet. I mean, we're not even 5 days, since these strikes happened. We're talking about events literally on the other side of the world, some of which are taking place far underground. We don't have visibility. Our intelligence, we have some intelligence assets, as does Israel, inside of Iran. But I don't think we know yet. And so this political back and forth is going to continue. But I think everybody should maybe just take a deep breath, step back for a second, and wait for some more facts to come in here.
And probably only the Iranians themselves likely know, and they may even not, considering the extent that it'll take to comb through the damage at those 3 sites. Speaking of Iran, generally you see these adversarial regimes come together, stick together in times when one's been attacked. I go back to the early 2000s and Axis of Evil when George W. Bush used the term. And we've seen Russia, stay close and have a partnership with regimes like Iran, North Korea over the years. China has been involved in extending their reach in the region. both Russia and China have issued, statements saying violation of international law and what have you. But it seems Iran may kind of have to go it alone in terms of what their long-term response will be to the situation, to the bombings, and how their nuclear program, if it exists in any kind of capacity, will be going forward. It seems they've backed themselves into a corner a little bit here, Ben.
Well, on a couple of different fronts. Number one, you have the axis of resistance that Iran has spent decades building across the Middle East that has been crushed in recent years, largely by Israel. We're talking about Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, even Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria that had targeted U.S. troops over the years. All of those, especially Hezbollah and Hamas, have just been absolutely crushed. So Hezbollah was very quick to come out and say that it's not getting involved. Whatever's left of Hezbollah not getting involved. We haven't seen much from the Houthis after the U.S. struck a ceasefire with them a couple of months ago. So you've got Iran's axis of resistance, these groups that are loyal to Tehran or had been, that are essentially either unable or unwilling to come to Iran's aid. Okay, so you have that. And then the axis of authoritarians or axis of, autocracies, whatever you want to call the collection of North Korea, Iran, China, and Russia. Some would say Venezuela should be included in that as well. The interesting thing, George, to me about this is, whether these countries want to admit it or not, there's a hierarchy in the axis. China is clearly, as the U.S. often says, the pacing threat for us in the 21st century. They're the most powerful member of this axis. They have the most far-reaching military, certainly the strongest economy by far over those other members of the axis, the most global influence. So, and Russia's probably next on that list with Iran and North Korea under it. So what you've seen over the past few years with different conflicts all around the world is the countries sort of on the lower rungs of the axis are willing to do things for the countries on the higher rung of the axis to try to get some benefit for themselves in return. North Korea and Iran were more than happy to begin sending drones, artillery, ammunition, things like that to Russia for its war in Ukraine. But is Russia necessarily willing to do a lot for Iran now that it's under direct attack by the U.S.? Other than rhetoric, we haven't really seen much so far. And it's worth noting, of course, Russia wanted China to do more for its war in Ukraine. China has, refrained from directly providing weapons and a lot of other capabilities that Russia has asked for repeatedly, I know, privately and publicly. And they just haven't gotten them because what's the benefit really for China in that instance? I think it's similar here with Iran. I mean, we've seen some statements that the former president of Russia, the former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, he, of course, came out with some just bewildering comments the other day in which he says that other nations are prepared to give Iran nuclear warheads. No sources that I've talked to really have any clue what he's talking about, because there's absolutely no national security interest for Russia whatsoever in having a nuclear-armed Iran run by a very strict religious government that wants to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. There's no strategic benefit for really any other member of the Axis from a nuclear-armed Iran. So there's a lot of rhetoric. The leaders of these countries like to project sort of a unified front against the U.S., against NATO, against the West, against Japan, South Korea, we can go on and on. But when the rubber meets the road in moments like this, and this is when you can see how strong the Axis, that connective tissue, how strong it is running in both directions all across this collection of countries. And the fact that you're getting nothing really other than strongly worded statements. You're not seeing a new wave of Russian missile defense systems or Chinese military equipment or sensors or radars or anything like that being, emergency fly in to Iran to help them. You're not seeing any of that. And there's a reason for that, George.
And that leaves us, I guess, to close out here, what are Iran's next steps, if there are any? They sent missiles in the direction of the U.S. military base in Qatar, but telegraphed that to the United States, and it was, easily intercepted and without much harm or damage done in Qatar. We've heard rumblings about lone wolves or sleeper cells. New York City, some other major places around the world have increased their posture in terms of policing and security. Potentially cyber attacks could be on the menu as well. Are there things that Iran will do in response now as kind of the ball is in their court, whether it's come back to the table on negotiations for a nuclear deal, which may seem kind of moot at this point, or something else that they would do to try to aggravate the United States further?
Are there things they could do? Absolutely. Will they? That remains to be seen. Because as you said, I think they kind of got the message, I think, over the past 2 weeks after this intense Israeli air campaign and the U.S. strikes. Domestically, it is worth pointing out, lest we forget, it wasn't that long ago that you had, folks who were accused of being affiliated with the Iranian government arrested in the U.S. for things like attempted assassination plots of former National White House Security Advisor John Bolton, even President Trump himself, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. You've had a number of these very high-profile cases of folks accused to have been working either, in some loose capacity or perhaps, directly at the behest of the Iranians or Iran-linked actors. So there is that aspect, which is, but that's not nothing, as they say. We need to keep that in mind. And you should presume, I think, as law enforcement, I'm sure does, that there are more of those here with more of those nefarious intentions in mind. Iranian cyber hackers, cyber attack groups, that always is a major concern for U.S. national security agencies. I don't think they have the reach into the United States that, say, China does, for example, to attack, infrastructure, local government, clean water supplies, rail systems, freight, that sort of thing. But they do have some capabilities, and that's certainly going to be something to watch. Regionally, in the Middle East, their military capabilities have been devastated, of course, by what we've seen, particularly by Israel over the past 10 or 12 days. But they haven't, of course, taken everything out. Iran's a fairly big country, certainly by Middle East standards, and they've got a lot of military equipment. They still got tons of drones. They got a lot of short range and medium range ballistic missiles. They've got anti-ship weapons, submarines, torpedoes, a lot of other capabilities. Now, the reach of those capabilities is limited and is probably more limited now. Well, not probably. It definitely is more limited now than it was 2 weeks ago. If they really wanted to attack a U.S. base, could they sort of throw the kitchen sink at it and probably hit it in some capacity? Yes. Do they want to do that? I have my doubts that they actually do at this point, because I'm not sure what purpose that would serve big picture for the Iranians. The last thing, George, just to keep in mind as we close out here, the Strait of Hormuz is kind of the one big trump card that Iran still has. It has a lot of naval capabilities by Middle East standards, especially torpedoes, submarines, and drones and ships, that it could close down the relatively narrow 90 miles or so Strait of Hormuz, through which over 20% of global oil travels through every single day. So if it wanted to play this economic trump card and just sort of throw the global economy into havoc, if you will, it could do that. Now, again, it needs to have some sort of strategic objective in mind if you were going to go there. I'm not sure they figured out exactly what that is, but they do have that in their back pocket, and they've got the military capability, at least right now, to do it if they choose to.
It's an evolving situation, and I know you and the entire Threat Status team will have your finger on the pulse of it. Ben, I appreciate the time as always. Thank you.
It's a pleasure, George. Thank you.
You can find Ben's work at WashingtonTimes.com. Just click on the Threat Status tab on the page, and as well on social media. I'm George Gerbo. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.